Now let's turn to Immanuel Kant's Was ist Aufklärung? What is enlightenment? A very short little essay that you've read, and one of Kant's more accessible works. He wrote many, many things, is quite prolific, and we'll talk more about his philosophy here in just a second. But let's take a look at his view of the Enlightenment. He wrote this in November 1784, so kind of at the peak of the Enlightenment. This is before the French Revolution was even, brewing, and the Enlightenment was kind of at its peak at this point. It was a short piece, a short essay to respond to a question in the Berlinische Monatsschrift, a German periodical. They had put forth the question, Kant had answered it, and they published the answer. Kant's answer, while not completely capturing the Enlightenment, has been seen as a kind of an essential statement, the quintessential statement really of what the Enlightenment is. So it doesn't capture every aspect, but it does a good job of giving you the kernel of it. He's basically saying here that humanity has willfully dithered around for a long time in ignorance, for thousands of years really, and that it's time to grow up. We should be exploring the world for new knowledge. So he kind of agrees with Bacon back in 1620, who wrote, the Novum Organum. Basically, we should just start afresh and build a new foundation. He says we should embrace, Kant says we should embrace the motto of sapere aude, to be audacious enough to know, be bold enough and courageous enough to be willing to know. Independent thinkers, he says, need the freedom to express their ideas and not be afraid of being persecuted for expressing those ideas. So there needs to be freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of communication. And that is one of the key ideas of the Enlightenment. So I've kind of written something here called the Guide to Enlightenment for Dummies. This is kind of what Kant is saying in brief. Grow up and think for yourself, okay? Start thinking for yourself. Wean yourself off of the pat answers that have been supplied to you by authority figures in your life for politics, morality, religion, health, and the meaning of life altogether. And sometimes this is not really comfortable. A lot of people like the kind of comfort zone of having a body of pat answers. And staying within that little bubble of pat answers for all the big questions of life and religion and morality and so forth, and politics and so forth and so on. And so what Kant says is that one, we're lazy, but two, it's a self-imposed type of immaturity. We are not willing to grow up. So he encourages us to have the autonomy of human reason to guide us to the truth. But you have to think. You have to stop being lazy. It takes a lot of effort to think well about so many things, okay? We just want a prepackaged cracker box of life's answers. And then we just want to eat those crackers with a bunch of other people who believe like we do. And so this way we don't have to think. And so many people buy a kind of prepackaged worldview. They buy into that worldview because they know, well, one, this one's popular. A lot of people believe this worldview. I'll buy into that. And then I don't have to think about any of the answers. This supplies all the answers I need. And I can also have a support group there. I can have the social comfort of having other people who believe like I do. And we'll all affirm each other. Okay. And so Kant says that that's the tendency of human beings to do that. And so what you need to do, what enlightenment means, is to start thinking for yourself. And I have obviously have seen this, I've experienced it myself and been there, but as a professor, often I have students who kind of ask me, well, what do we believe about this, or what do we believe about that? Like they just want a prepackaged answer to some huge question so that they don't have to think about it. And I usually do not let them get away with that. Force them to answer the question themselves, for themselves, okay? So Kant tells us just stop. Just stop being an immature kind of thinker. Well, you're not really even a thinker at all. Just stop doing this, this kind of living in your little comfort bubble, your comfort zone, and get out of it and start learning for yourself. So that's really the upshot of the spirit of what he's trying to say in this little essay. Let's move now to one other related theme that I mentioned earlier, and that's the decline of religious influence and the shift from theism to deism to naturalism. The rise of D isms, and there were various D isms, by the way, during the Enlightenment, occurs because there are many views, but there's one common theme. In other words, there are various types of deisms. But what is deism? In a nutshell, deism is this idea that there is a God. So D means God, so this is kind of like a Godism. Why did the Enlightenment thinkers favor deism? Because it allowed them to say, yes, I believe in God. I'm not an atheist, which has, even till this day, had some stigma to it. But I do believe that there's a God, there is a creator, there's a transcendent being. But this being is not really involved in this world at all. This God, this creator, providence, if you will, has made a perfect world that is mechanistically exquisite. It's like a giant clock, even Voltaire used this imagery. It's like a giant clock, if you will, or a machine that has been exquisitely fine-tuned by this designer, this creator. And now it's been powered up, wound up, and left to itself. It's so exquisite in its fine-tuning that there's no need for God to intervene in this world anymore. So God doesn't. God is not here in this world according to the deistic view. God is outside this world. He's transcendent. That is, He exists, but not in this cosmos. And so, that means that God doesn't intervene and do miracles. God doesn't intervene and give us information, such as Scripture. And those two things alone, kind of remove a huge Christian shell from religious belief. So this is a religion of reason. It's an attempt to say that the only things that we should believe are things that pass through the grid of reason. So it's a rational religion. And so deism, a religion of reason, and with revealed truth eliminated, faith filtered through reason, enables God in this worldview. It enables one to believe in God, but it's a total rejection of any revealed religion. Now, it's very pluralistic in the sense that most deists believe that all world religions, Islam, Buddhism, etc., Hinduism, all of them contain essential parts or common elements that they share these common elements. And so all the religions of the world have vestiges of a rational religion within them. Now here's some of the key deists. In France, Voltaire and some of the encyclopedists, Diderot and D'Alembert, even though they probably were truly atheists, they had to portray themselves often as deists to avoid persecution. In the United States, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Paine and Ethan Allen, all of these were deist thinkers. Many of the founding fathers were theists, that is, that they were full-blown Christians, but some of them were deists and held to this vision of God. In Germany, Kant is one of the greatest deists, and most of the people who engage in biblical criticism as well. Deism was not quite as popular in England. John Locke, that we've looked at earlier, sometimes he didn't like the term deism, but often he looked like a deist. And sometimes, though, he would look like a theist. So he seemed like he kind of, wiggled around on that, depending on the context. But in England, the first person to set forth a full-blown deistic worldview was Herbert of Cherbury. Anyway, deism will go on to be a big movement in the Enlightenment, but it's going to be kind of a temporary movement. In the 19th century, a full-blown naturalism, essentially materialistic atheism, is going to arise and be a replacement for deism. Darwin's theories after 1859 will advance naturalism, and then we will see deism begin to decline, because really there's no longer any need for it. It's kind of superfluous. You're either a theist or an atheist, a naturalist. So theism will continue and rise in opposition to naturalism, while deism will kind of begin to wane and go away. Separation of faith and reason will go on to become a normal way to relate these two great parts of the human experience, faith and reason. In the old world, say up until Luther, we saw faith and reason in some way or another united. But eventually with nominalism, then faith and reason will start to be separated. By the time you get to the Enlightenment, they're no longer separated, they're fully divorced. That is, they really have nothing to do with each other. Then, when we get up to the 19th century and then early 20th century, we'll start to see not just a situation where faith and reason relate to each other by coexisting in a divorce type scenario, but they will relate to each other in a hostility scenario. That is, where they will become antagonistic toward each other and try to destroy each other, okay? So that will be the rise of secularism. So now we're going to take a look at Immanuel Kant and some of his kind of world-changing ideas. He was born in 1724, died in 1804. And as I've said already, his death kind of marked the end of the Enlightenment along with the French Revolution. He's one of the greatest and most influential philosophers of all time, not just the Enlightenment era. And some would say he was the greatest philosopher since Aristotle, which was about 2,000 years. And that since Kant, there probably hasn't been a philosopher who's had as much influence. Now, one of the things that he's responding to is Hume's skepticism. Hume's empirical skepticism had created a kind of a crisis for all knowledge. And Kant read this. Kant at this time, as he read Hume, was a rationalist philosopher. Now, remember, we have two different competing schools of philosophy at this time, epistemological schools. Empiricists say that all knowledge comes through the senses, and rationalists say that all knowledge starts in the mind with ideas and concepts that are preloaded, if you will, into intelligence. They don't come through experience. So Kant is of the latter school. He's a rationalist. He comes from that Cartesian and Leibnizian continental rationalist school. And so Hume's ideas had carried Locke's ideas to a logical conclusion, and that is that all knowledge has to come through the senses, period, bar none, there is no other way. And that if that's the case, ultimately all you know is what you sense. And if all you know is what you sense, there are critical ideas that just don't arise from sense experience. And one of Hume's great mind experiments that he does is to give you the illustration of two billiard balls. And so if you have a billiard table and you hit the cue ball and it goes down and hits the 8 ball and knocks it into the corner pocket, you might think, oh, that the cue ball caused the 8 ball to go into the corner pocket. And you could do this over and over and over and over again. Hume says you would be wrong to assume, or wrong to conclude and think that the cue ball caused the 8 ball to go into the pocket. All you see is a temporal sequence. The cue ball hits the 8 ball and it goes into the corner pocket. You don't see cause. Cause is something that you infer, but it's not observable. And you might think, oh yes it is, it's common sense. Humans say, no it's not. All you see is temporal sequence. You do not see causality. Causality is something that's metaphysical, it's something beyond this world. And since we can't believe in anything that doesn't come through the senses, you are left in a kind of a state of skepticism about causality. Why is that so important? Because the whole scientific quest is about finding causes. And so Kant realized that if Hume is correct and if Hume's ideas spread, skepticism will spread and the whole scientific quest could be unplugged. And so the Enlightenment project would be unplugged. This whole attempt to achieve scientific knowledge for progress and to make humanity better would be unplugged. And so Kant decides to try to solve this problem, and he takes about 10 years to write this book, Critique of Pure Reason. One of the most important books, but yet one of the most difficult books ever to understand. Very opaque, very difficult, to understand and grasp. The only other philosopher I would say is more difficult than Kant would be one of his successors, Hegel. And so, anyway, the Critique of Pure Reason will become the cornerstone of modern and contemporary philosophy. And I'm going to try to explain to you some of the basic ideas. Now, Alfred North Whitehead famously said that all Western philosophy is a kind of a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's true, I believe. But it could also be said that all philosophy in the past 2.5 centuries is a footnote to Kant. And ever since Kant, he's a watershed in modern contemporary philosophy, in some way or another is responding to or reacting against Kant's ideas. So either accept him or reject him, but no one can really ignore his monumental contributions to philosophy. And his philosophy, known as critical philosophy or transcendental idealism, to give it a more precise term, will become a major turning point in thought. His ideas revolutionize epistemology and deliver a kind of severe blow to metaphysics. And he establishes also, in other words, another thing to the school of ethics, or he establishes a school of ethics that will be significant all the way down till today. We'll look at his ethics here briefly as well. So now let's take a look at Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. As I said, Hume's skepticism on causality could unplug science. Kant is going to respond by building a kind of a hybrid of empiricism and rationalism. He's going to blend and meld them together in such a way as to make them both necessary, and he's going to marry them together. Before, they had kind of been at odds with each other, and so he's going to show us that knowledge must be empirical and knowledge must be rational. You can't have it either or, it has to be both and. So, the place to start is understanding that there are analytic statements and synthetic statements. Analytic statements are called a priori truths. And an a priori truth is something that really doesn't say anything about the world, but it is necessarily true by definition. If I say all triangles have 3 sides, this is true by definition. It's an a priori truth. You don't need to see a triangle. I don't have to draw a triangle for you to understand it. It is a truth that precedes any experience. It's an a priori truth. But it doesn't tell you, that statement that all triangles have 3 sides doesn't tell you whether there are any triangles in the world. Okay? So these are just simply things true by definition. All unmarried males are bachelors. It's just true by definition. It doesn't tell me whether Tom over here is a bachelor or not. It just tells me that if he is a bachelor, then he must be an unmarried male. Okay? So that's an analytic statement. And Hume would agree that such statements were admissible. The next statement that you have, the next type of statements that you had before Kant were synthetic statements. These are a posteriori statements, that is, they're after experience, they're post-experience. But synthetic statements are about the actual world. But they are subject to the vagaries of empirical skepticism. And so if I say, I see a triangle, well, all I'm doing is reporting what my senses are telling me, but my senses could be tricked, okay? And so a synthetic statement is a statement about something in the actual world. And so during Hume's day, it was accepted that you can only have 2 different types of statements, analytic statements and synthetic statements, okay? Now what Kant is going to do to try to blend these together is come up with a novel approach, and it's called the synthetic a posteriori, or the synthetic a priori. This is a previously unheard of, and it's usually considered to be an audacious idea because it seemed contradictory, but Kant will show that it isn't. A synthetic a priori is something that you know before experience, but it tells you something about the actual world, which the empiricist up until this time could not even imagine accepting such an idea, because no one had showed them that such statements were possible. Now remember, Kant is a rationalist. He likes the rationalist thought, that is, the notion that ideas drive all knowledge. So he wants to find a way to bring his rationalism and blend it with the empiricism. So he agrees with Hume that all knowledge has to come through the senses. Locke had said that all knowledge comes through the senses and is written on the mind like a blank piece of paper, the tabula rasa theory. And so Kant agrees that all knowledge about the world has to come through the senses, but that perception of the world is filtered through synthetic a priori categories of the understanding. And Kant called this his Copernican revolution in epistemology, and he was correct. Now, what is a synthetic a priori? Well, Kant says that as we perceive the world, as sensations flow in, perhaps through my eyes, my ears, my senses, in any one of my five senses, as information flows in through the senses, that information, those perceptions, are going to be filtered by certain pre-understandings, preset categories in my the rational structure of my mind, and that I impose those preset understandings upon the information. In other words, the only way that I make sense out of that information is by imposing those categories on that information. And I'll explain why he called this his Copernican revolution in just a second. But think of it like this. His two super categories, there are 12 categories plus two super categories, but the two main categories, the super categories, are space and time, okay? And so space and time, the idea is that if I perceive something in this world, it must happen in a spatio-temporal kind of context. In other words, I impose space and time upon my perceptions. And he's going to then go on to the other 12 categories, and the most critical one there for our examples here, based on what we've been talking about in this whole course, will be causality. That if there is an event, then that event must have some type of cause. There are no uncaused events. Every event has to have a cause. And so I'm imposing causality on my perceptions. I can't make sense out of that perception at all without these categories, space, time, and causality, and the other 11 ones, other 11 categories that he mentions, such as substance, okay? And so I'm imposing that upon my perceptions. So the upshot is this: human perceptions of the world conform to a universal human set of categories of understanding. Space and time are the two super categories, and then the 12 other categories that fall under space and time. And as kind of a sidebar, Einstein will later collapse those two categories, space and time, into one, space-time, in his theory of relativity, which I can't go into just yet, but I want you to understand that these categories of space and time are still kind of active in our world, but have been collapsed into one. But the main category to consider at this point is cause, as I've said before. But Hume said that cause is illusory. When the cue ball hits the 8 ball, he says it's just an illusion that it causes that. You can't see causality. You cannot perceive causality. All you perceive is sequence, temporal sequence. And therefore, we latch on to causality and say, aha, I've discovered the cause. But no, he says it's just a kind of a weak, puny habit of human reasoning. But Kant will say that causality is a precondition of understanding. In other words, if anything at all occurs, it must occur in space-time, and it must be caused. And hence, he calls these transcendental categories of understanding. Now, the word transcendental is used in other contexts, such as transcendental meditation and things like that. It has nothing to do with that. What he's saying here is that these categories transcend any perceptions. That is, that they are what are going to shape and mold those transitions as they come into my mind. And so they transcend all experiences. So that is the basic idea of Kant's critique of pure reason. There are many, many other ideas there. He gets into his antinomies, and I wish I had time to explore his antinomies, especially the one on free will. The upshot there on his third antinomy, the one on free will, is this, that there's no way to know whether we have free will or not. And it's, in other words, reason alone will show you that you're a fully determined being, or reason alone can show you that you're a free being. And so there's no way to reconcile those two. There's no way to know whether you're free or whether you're fully determined. And Kant's inability to solve that, his antinomy, and he has 4 antinomies there in the critique. Those 4 antinomies will show that there are limits to reason. This is why this is a critique of pure reason. Pure reason alone cannot get you to every answer in life. And that one, by the way, is quite important. Are you free or are you determined? You remember, Luther and Erasmus had the same question. Okay, Luther and Erasmus, of course, are doing it within a theistic context, and Luther says you're divinely determined, and Erasmus is saying, no, you have at least a measure of free will. In this context, Kant is exploring whether you are determined by nature, by the laws of physics, for example, or whether you have a measure of freedom. And he's saying that reason cannot solve this. It cannot cut this Gordian knot. Until this very day, this question is persistent, and it's deeply significant for human beings as to whether we're free or whether we're determined, okay, because it ties right into responsibility and morality. Okay, now we're going to look at Kant's dualism of nature. And this is the way Kant structures the world, and this is going to explain a lot about why Kant's philosophy was so influential. Kant held that there are 2 realms of existence, 2 realms of being, if you will. One is the noumena. That's a spiritual world. It's a mental world. It's a world of ideas and concepts. It's a non-physical world. And then you have a phenomenal world. This is a world of phenomena, things that are observable to the senses. This is the physical world. Now, on the upper tier, you really cannot know anything about that upper tier. There's no way to have true knowledge. On the bottom sphere, or the bottom tier, there is a way to have knowledge, and that's through the senses, you know, applying the categories to the sensations and so forth that we just talked about in the critique, okay? So that is the world of knowledge, and the world of the noumena, the upper tier, is simply a world of belief. Now, I'm going to give you the illustration of the Kant box. I use this all the time. In my classes, I actually have a box that I built, and I don't have it with me, but I'm going to explain the box to you, and if you could use this illustration, it's kind of an object lesson to explain it to others. But in this box, it's completely closed off, except there's one hole in the box. And so what I do is I'll have a poor victim or a student reach into the box and try to find something in the box. And so as they feel around, they find an object inside the box, okay? I usually tell them that it's been well fed, don't worry, it doesn't bite, you know. Of course, that heightens the excitement, and usually, you know, slightest little jitter will make them jump. But anyway, as they're feeling around inside the box, they find the object, and I tell them to examine it with their hand, don't take it out. And then after, you know, they've done that, I ask them, well, what did you find there? What did you learn? And they'll say, well, it appeared to be like a cube, a wooden cube or something maybe, you know, made out of wood or something like that. I reach in and pull it out and I say, well, you thought it was a wooden cube, and it appears to be a wooden cube, but actually there's a message written on each side. On one side it says God exists. On the next side it says you have free will. On the next side it says you have an immortal soul. On the next side it says the Bible is the Word of God, and so forth and so on. And maybe on the other side it says God loves you. In other words, all of the truths, I tell them, look, you thought it was a wooden block, but really what it was were metaphysical messages. These are deep metaphysical claims about the world, about the world beyond the physical world. If in fact God exists, if in fact you have an immortal soul, and if in fact you do have free will, that changes everything. Get rid of those three things, and it changes everything. So, what Kant is saying is you can't know what's in that box. You thought it was a wooden block, but it was really the noumena. I had you reaching into the noumena and trying to discover metaphysical truths, but you had no way to discover those truths. And Kant says it's the same thing about the noumena. Now, metaphysics are therefore relegated in Kant's view to a realm of belief, a realm of opinion, if you will. They're not knowable. Just as you couldn't know by reaching into the box what was written on the cube, likewise Kant says you can't know what's in the noumena. Only the phenomena are knowable. Only the things down in the observable world are the world of knowing. But phenomena are only known through the senses and the categories of the understanding that we just looked at. So I really don't know the thing in itself. When I observe an apple or when I observe an acorn or anything like that, I'm not really observing the thing in itself. I'm only observing my perceptions of the thing. So I really don't know what it is in any type of essential way. So, like we've already seen, the world of essences has been swept away. Kant too agrees. There's no way to know what the essence of anything is. And if you don't know what the essence of anything is, you don't know what it is. You just know what it appears to be to your senses. And you know what we all call that thing. We call that thing an apple. Is it? What is it? We don't know. It's just something we call an apple. Okay. Moreover, I don't really know what you perceive. When you perceive that thing, I'm locked into my own stream of perceptions. You're locked into your stream of perceptions. So I don't perceive what you perceive. And therefore you can see, even though Kant is trying to get away from skepticism, he doesn't really get away. All that you really know are your perceptions filtered through your own categories. And of course, we share the categories, but nevertheless, I have my stream of sensations and you have yours. Remember the illustration about the two women, one being completely colorblind and the other one having supervision and seeing 100 times more colors than the average person. When they look at the apple, their perceptions are completely different. And so the colorblind woman could not even dream and could not even imagine what the other person is seeing, the other perceptions. And so we're left in a world of critical assessment of how we perceive things. And there is some truth to this. Yes, there are colorblind people and people have supercolor vision. And I don't know how they see the world. I just have normal vision and I can't even understand either one of the two, really. But the point being that I am locked into my perceptions of things. But some of us believe that at least it is possible to know, to intuit what is beyond the thing to its essence. But Kant says you can't know the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. And that's a metaphysical trait. So some of the implications for our day are, and the implications for this moving out were quite vast and rolled on for centuries after Kant, is that there are critical approaches to knowing that will dominate the world of epistemology today. One would be like critical realism, which recognizes that, look, there is a real world out there, but the way we perceive that world is deeply affected by our perceptions. And so this would be Kant's dualism of nature. Now, that upper tier, all those metaphysical beliefs up there, that God exists, you have free will, you have an immortal soul, those kind of beliefs, really significant beliefs. He says you can't know them, but you probably ought to believe them anyway. because it's practical to believe them. Why is it practical to believe them? Because if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in free will, and you don't believe that you have an immortal soul, then morality is going to be very, very difficult. Morality is going to tank. In other words, we won't hold together as a society without beliefs in the kind of permanent justice that comes through immortal life, immortal soul, and so forth. And so in the critique of practical judgment, Kant will explain why some of these ideas are still useful. They're still good beliefs, even though they're not knowledge. Next, we're going to look at Kant's Deontological Ethics. Kant is usually seen as being the founder of, or at least the key figure in the whole philosophical school known as Deontological Ethics. Now, don't let the word deontological scare you. Deon simply means duty. So a study of duty, duty to logical, if you will, ethics, duty-driven ethics, okay? And so there were various other schools of ethics floating around at the time. The two big ones were the old classical view of ethics that's known as virtue ethics. And you've probably read or heard of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which sets forth the whole virtue ethic approach. The idea being that you search for virtues, right ways to act, and avoid going to excesses or deficiencies in the search for these virtues. But there are no rules in such a system, okay? And so then you had the rise of another school of ethics, and it tracks all the way back to ancient times as well. In ancient times it was known as hedonism, but in Kant's day it was known as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism grew out of ancient hedonism, but the idea of utilitarianism was that we should act according to principles that bring the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. In other words, we look for the utility, the practical kind of benefits that come from moral action. And so Kant was very much opposed to utilitarianism. And he thought that, and many others agree with him, that it kind of leads us to an end justifies the means approach to human life. And that if the end justifies the means, we can find out, whatever means are necessary scientifically, we can, study this to attain the ends that we want. And so this is sometimes called consequentialism. The idea being we focus on the consequences of actions, not on, what the actions themselves. And so Kant came up with an imperative. This is known as the Categorical Imperative. All this is in a little book that he wrote that's much more accessible than most of his philosophy, called The Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals in 1798. And in here he teaches that there is a rational principle that is proper for all moral action. And our moral action should be driven by duties. And so this is a rule-based system, but there's one rule to rule them all, and that is the categorical imperative. Now there's a hypothetical imperative as well. If you want this, then do this, okay? And so, if you don't want to freeze, then put on your coat. It's essentially, if you want that result, then this is the means to get to that result. But Kant says we have to move beyond that to avoid utilitarianism to something that is an imperative for all moral situations in all times and all places. And so what he searches for is a principle that's universalizable. And this is his categorical imperative, which basically goes like this. Act upon that principle that you could wish and will that all people in all times and all places would act. In other words, it has to be something that can be universalized. So we often use this type of thinking all the time, and it's something that even a small child can understand. You can imagine, a bully out on the playground, pushing kids around and, pushing kids off of the other, the swing or the slide or something like that. And the teacher comes over and grabs him by the shoulders and shakes him a little bit and says, you have to stop doing that. You cannot continue to act like that. You can't push the other kids off What if all the kids did that? In other words, your actions are not universalizable. The principle of your action cannot be turned into a universalized principle of action. And so, that's kind of a hyper-simplified version of it, but all dressed up in its philosophical dress. The categorical imperative basically says, act upon that maxim that you could wish and will that all people would act at all times. Now, this is a lot like the Golden Rule, or like Christ's love your neighbor as you love yourself. But it's just stated in a more philosophical and rationalistic, highly rational form, and Kant does believe that it is rational. For example, a thief could not wish and will that all people in all times and all places would steal, because to do so would be to undermine all of his actions and would mean for people to steal from him. And so likewise with all the other actions that we consider deplorable human actions. So everything has to be universalized. Now, there was one other school of ethics that was in place and is soon to be popularized after Kant, and it's called Egoistic Ethics. The idea here is that one should act upon that principle to maximize one's self-interest in all times and all places. Okay. Nietzsche will promote this, as will other thinkers after him. Ayn Rand will be one in the 20th century who promotes this in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. But egoistic ethics basically says, act in your own self-interest in all times and all places. Now, it might be in my self-interest to make sure that you're doing okay. You know, I don't want you completely starving to death, and so I might give you a little bit of food if you were starving, only because I don't want you to attack me and kill me or something like that. So I can have enlightened self-interest and help you, but really I'm only helping you to help myself, okay? So egoism is to act in your own self-interest. But this is fundamentally opposed to deontological ethics and fundamentally opposed to what Kant is saying, and here's why. The egoistic approach, the fundamental principle or rule of egoism, act in your own self-interest at all times, is not something you could ever universalize. It's not something you could share with anyone. In other words, if I was to sincerely embrace an egoistic principle of ethics, I could never tell someone else that they too should be egoistic. Because now, if they're going to act egoistically, then that may come back to harm me. Just imagine that if I was an employee in a business or a job and somebody else was a fellow employee and I told them to act egoistically, well, it could very well be the case that they do things to make me look bad to promote themselves and get a promotion. So the best thing I could do if I'm really an egoist is to keep it a secret and not tell anyone. So how can this be a good school of ethics, a normative school of ethics, telling people how they ought to behave if you really can't ever share it with anyone? So Kant's deontological ethics, a rule-based system based on duty, is your duty to follow the categorical imperative, is really an attempt to answer some of the failings of these other schools of ethics in his groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, 1798. So, just to wrap things up here, what are some of the conclusions that we can see looking at the Enlightenment in Kantian philosophy? The Enlightenment is a pivotal period in which our culture fully begins to shift away from the old world, the metaphysical world, the world of authorities, the world of revealed truth, and it moves towards a kind of new dawn of seeking truth for ourselves, putting human reason in the driver's seat, so to speak, and not just human reason altogether, but your individual human reason. Kant tells you to grow up and begin to examine the world for yourself and think for yourself, be a critical thinker. And so this Enlightenment mentality, fueled with modern science, will lead a turn away from religion and towards deism, and then ultimately to a full-blown kind of naturalism. So these are some of the major themes of the Enlightenment and Kantian philosophy.